All right, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And as per normal, our agenda is going to be that I'm going to go through some of the week's solar news or renewable energy news, things that have been happening in the past 7 days, 10 days, whatever. Then we'll look at some of the events that are coming up and webinars, conferences. And then we look at focusing on a specific item of interest to me, and hopefully it's of interest to you. And this week, we're going to look at small nuclear power plants, small nuclear reactors. So I think there's some interesting stuff going on there. So, and all right. So anyway, let me jump here. All right, so in 2024, electricity generated from solar is expected to surpass power generated by hydro. That'll be the first time that happens. In 2019, wind energy surpassed hydro as a source of electricity here in the United States. It's kind of interesting that that while solar has been growing at about an annualized rate of about 44% a year since 2009, hydro has been still growing, but at an anemic about a 1% rate. In 1945, hydro made up about 84% of the US's generating capacity. Of course, it's remained relatively stable while all other sources continue to expand pretty dramatically. It was passed by coal in 1956 coal became the #1 source. And by this time, of course, natural gas is the #1 source. But in 2022, wind is expected to made up about 10%, hydro about 6%, solar about 3%. And next year, it's projected wind will be about 12%, solar about 7%, and hydro about 6%. So solar continues to grow very, very rapidly. The Department of Department of Energy and the U.S. Geological Survey have launched an online database that's now available. It's a database of all of the large solar sites across the country, 1 megawatt or bigger. There are currently about 4,000 in this database. It's only updated as of the end of 2021. So not 100% up to date, but getting there. The data that you can look up is panel type, the type of installation that's there, the initial year of operation, and what is the surface area that's covered by this. It's anticipated a lot of folks in the industry will use this for reference, as well as government or research projects, things of that nature. An analytic firm known as Ascend Analytics recently predicted, and this made a fair amount of news, that most of the projects that are currently in the pipeline for energy generation here in the US will never be built. And I guess if you start looking at the numbers, it's kind of a Captain Obvious kind of moment here. They're arguing that there are simply too many projects chasing too few materials. There are shortages of materials there, panels, inverters, that kind of thing. Shortages of labor, shortages of capital that's interested in investing in this. And again, one of the major problems here, one of the reasons for this problem is the interconnection process for these large systems. Often takes as much as 5 years from the time that you apply before your application is even considered. And because they do it on a first in, first out kind of process, then a developer, if they're even thinking about developing a project, they go ahead and apply for interconnection, go through that paperwork, because 5 years from now, if they may be ready or they may not, but it doesn't hurt to get all of these things in the pipeline. Currently, we have about 106 gigawatts of solar operating nationwide. In 2022, about 20 gigawatts was installed, and there are over 900 gigawatts of solar in the pipeline to be installed. So if you think about that, if in 2022 we installed 20 and there's almost 1,000 that are there in the pipeline, that's like, what is that? 50 years of installation? I mean, there's just no way. And there's over 1,450 gigawatts from all sources, and the US grid only has a capacity of 1,250. So again, Captain Obvious, where you've got so much stuff in the pipeline, it just simply cannot be built. So a lot of these numbers we see, if they're referencing what's in the pipeline, we should take that with a grain of salt, because they're never going to be built. All right, NREL recently conducted some tests for the US military, and they were looking at the resiliency of solar plus storage when compared with diesel as an energy source in combat and non-combative situations for the military. And what they found was a little bit surprising, in that solar and battery is actually much more resilient than diesel power as far as uptime. Solar and storage, they found about a 95% uptime compared to about 80% for diesel generating. And again, surprisingly, solar plus storage was actually much cheaper than using diesel fuel and diesel generators in these systems over time. And another thing with the military, and I've heard this from a lot of veterans of Afghanistan, they say so many people were killed in the transport of diesel tankers, because of course you've got this energy source that's very slow moving and quite a good target. So solar plus storage definitely looks like an option. Michigan just passed one of the most aggressive renewable energy laws in the nation. Senate Bill 271 mandates that the two investor-owned utilities operating within the state, and that's Consumers Energy and DTE Energy. I think that is like Detroit Edison. Anyway, they must reach 80% from carbon-free sources for their electric generation by 2035. They must reach 100% by 2040. Currently, or as of 2022, they were operating at about 16%. So as you can see, this is quite an aggressive process there for them. This continues a trend of aggressive state mandates. In 2019, only 5 states nationwide had mandated 100% carbon-free. By 2021, that had increased to 12 states. And today, with adding in Michigan, we're up to about 23 states that have mandated by a certain date, it could be as late as 2050, that we be operating 100% carbon-free. The Air Force has recently petitioned that there be a 5-mile exclusion zone, or a buffer zone, around nuclear launch sites where wind turbines cannot be placed. And what they're saying is they feel that these wind turbines, which are starting to encroach in closer and closer to these facilities, pose a hazard to helicopter pilots who may be flying personnel into those facilities. There are hundreds of these launch sites spread throughout Nebraska, Colorado, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming. And it struck me that now, if you want to know where there is a nuclear launch site, just look for a 5-mile exclusion zone, dead center of wind turbines, and that's where it is. So, little hint there. All right, well, that's the news from the solar industry for this week. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add? Anything that came up that struck their fancy? I'll give you just a second to pop in. All right, and again, feel free to interrupt as I go through, because so much of it is helpful when you guys have some insights into these things. Let me jump into some of the events that are coming up. They're on November 24th, 2 p.m. There's Mastering UL 3741. This has to do with rapid shutdown issues without modular level power electronics on top of buildings. So this is one of the little hot topic debates for those of us who geek out about solar. There's December 5th, 2 p.m., creating an inclusive site. What they're talking about now is, especially with these large systems, you're getting a lot of different trades involved in there. So that's a webinar coming up. It's sponsored by CEA. December 6th, 800-volt strings. So that's becoming more and more prevalent. You're getting up to that 1,000-volt limitation for these kind of larger installations. Talking about how that works. December 7th, risks and opportunities in solar for 2024. So I think this is a futuristic look ahead. What are some of the issues that are going to be faced over the coming year? That one looks pretty interesting. And then there's a conference coming up on January 17th through 19th in San Diego, California. It's the Intersolar North America and the Energy Storage North America. So that's an upcoming trade show conference type event. And then as per normal, we have our online training and in-person training. You can find that at solarpvtraining.com. So that's my shameless self-promotion. So anyway, that's the events. Again, I'll ask if anybody's got anything to add to the mix here. Any other things that you're aware of that we want to make other folks aware of as well? One other thing that I didn't put it in a slide, but I did get an email from a company, I think it's Sun Electric. It might be those folks. Anyway, they have some remainder solar panels. Looks like a lot of them. So if you're doing a project where you want to get some really inexpensive solar panels, the thing he was selling were like 190-watt panels, which are not really something new installations or commercial installers are going to use because they're all up in the 300 to 400-watt range for their panels. But these 190s, 195s, still good panels. And he was selling them off at 15 cents a watt, something like that. So super cheap. You get a panel for 35 bucks. So if you've got a project where that might work, drop me a note. I'll send you the details there on where to get a hold of those. But I just thought that was worth passing along to you guys. Okay. Yeah, Pete, you have a question?
Yeah. Where are the panels located? What state?
Oh, well, let me see. If it is that company, they're down in Florida. I know that's where they are. I hesitate to, here we go. Yeah, this is, yeah, it's Sun Electric. So I think he is located. Yeah, he's in Miami. He's in Miami.
Okay.
So
of course, shipping on these things is at this point is expensive or more expensive than even new panels.
Well, it's winter time. Get in the pickup truck, head down to Miami, right off your trip. That sounds like a plan. So anybody else have any questions? Yeah, Ed?
How about a code question for the group?
Sure.
So I'm in the 2017 NEC and I'm in 690 and I'm in part 8 and it's energy storage systems. And it reads that an energy storage system connected to a PV system shall be installed in accordance with 706. And in 706, in the scope, it brackets the voltage for the storage system at 50 volts AC or 60 volts DC. And I'm working with a lithium battery system that has a maximum voltage of 51.2 volts. So does that put me back in 480? Or what code chapter do I apply or section? I'm sorry, article.
Yeah.
Do I apply?
Yeah, you're bringing up an interesting point, and I've tried to research some of that stuff because it seems to me, and maybe somebody who has a better detailed understanding of the NEC can correct me on this, but when I've gone through and turned all the pages trying to track it down, it used to be pretty simple with the lead acid batteries. They said maximum 50 volts. And then they put in another section there in that 2017 time period where they referenced 100 volt for some of these storage systems. It's when they started pulling things out of other chapters and trying to make a battery or an energy storage chapter. And I felt like they kind of got both of them in there at the same time without maybe realizing it. And then they kind of eliminated it altogether, any reference. And then they went to the thing of if it's an inaccessible system, it's unlimited voltage. And I guess that's just a long-winded way of saying that for me, it's infinitely confusing as to what those limitations are. But in today's market, those lithium ion batteries are typically going to be operating at a significantly higher voltage than 50 volts. And then you start to get into the new standard, and I think it's NEC 1, the fire safety, but I don't remember the reference, but this is the one that we've talked about before, where now they're saying these batteries have to be stored outside. You can't even put them inside. But that one doesn't, it's part of the 2023 code, and states haven't adopted 2023 code for the most part. So you may have a 3-year period, and we're waiting to see if they come up with changes in the interim, but it's confusing. Does anybody have better insight than I have on that? Yeah, Pete?
Okay, I'm with you. If the classes at our MREA, they taught us that the voltage limit of 50 volts and lower referred to the design size of the battery. So for nominal 12-volt batteries is 48 volts. That they charge at 54 volts or 56 volts, that isn't their intent. It's the design size of the batteries. So if the other guy has battery pack that's rated 48 volts, they're going to treat it at 48 volts, even though he may charge it to 54 or 56.
Yeah.
That's what we were taught back then.
Yeah, and there's of course AC versus DC voltage, that goes into effect. It's a little bit different. But yeah, if you've got a nominal 48 volt battery bank, regardless of where it's at, they're going to accept that at that 50 volt limit. But I don't even think that 50 volt limit applies anymore. I think that's been kind of wiped out. But of course, if you're still working from the 2017 code, which many states still are, now you got to deal with, what's your inspector looking for?
So I should probably call the AHJ and see where they want me to look.
Yeah, because if you're dealing with the difference between 51 volts and 50, they're gonna just kind of go, yeah, whatever.
It's actually 60 for DC. AC is 50 and DC is 60. In the scope of that article, energy storage systems operating at over 50 volts AC or 60 volts DC that may be standalone or interactive with other electric power production sources. Yeah. So the DC cutoff is actually 60 volts. And the battery spec, none of these will be in series, of course. They're not allowed to be. The charge bulk voltage is 54.4, still well below the 60 volt threshold.
Yeah, I think you'll be fine on that. The question is, will they allow you to have them inside? My guess is yes. What state are you in?
Idaho.
Idaho. Yeah, I don't know. You're still operating off the 2017 NEC?
Yep, still 2017. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure you already know more than your code official does about battery voltages. So, it may be what kind of day he's having as to what kind of response he's going to give you. So
understandable.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think if you do run it down to ground, if you could let us know, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I sure will. Thanks.
Sure.
They sure muddy the waters.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we sort of live in muddy waters here. So anybody else have anything you want to bring up for the good of the cause? Any issues you've run into this week? All right. In the meantime, again, feel free to interrupt, but I'm going to jump into, I guess my question coming from the Wizard of Oz here is nuclear undeniably and reliably dead? So this is my question I posed to myself, and I'll get to why this sort of popped up in my brain this week, because there is some news that's been happening. But the nuclear industry has kind of always lived off hype. Back in 1954, when the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the Atomic Regulatory Commission at the time, Louis Strauss, he predicted that our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter. Now, of course, he was talking about nuclear. I might make the same kind of prediction around solar, but that was the hype at the time. I don't think that's come to play clearly. But then we started to see a number of problems happening within the nuclear industry. I don't know if I blow up. Nope, I didn't blow up that map. But this is the a diagram of the installations of nuclear, and the little red lines there. 3 Mile Island happened, and then Chernobyl happened, and of course Chernobyl. You can see the drop off in nuclear after those two nuclear disasters occur. We were going along for a period of time where nuclear was really kind of forbidden, you know, in many people's minds. Then you start to see this ramp up again of folks starting to say, you know what, nuclear maybe not so bad. And then Fukushima happens, and then it drops off again. So it's been a fairly dramatic or familiar pattern. It always reminds me of the old line, I think it was in the movie Moonstruck, where, you know, it's a good technology unless something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong. So, you know, we can pretty much count that we don't know when, but something's going to go wrong with all technology. And with nuclear, the impact is just pretty dramatic. So what is being planned worldwide? Where are any nuclear reactors that are in the offing? Where are they being planned? And far and away, most of them are being planned in China. 25 nuclear reactors are currently planned between now and 2030 in China. And I should just sort of caution, just because these things are being planned doesn't mean they're going to get built. But this is what's in the offing. India has 8 underway, Turkey 4, Korea 3, Russia 3, Egypt 3, Bangladesh 2, and then you start seeing the United Arab Emirates, France, USA, UK, Iran, Slovakia, Argentina, and Brazil each have 1. So that's kind of where the activity is taking place. I don't think the USA one's going to get built. I suspect the UK one's not going to get built. But anyway, these are so mostly China, India, Turkey. That's kind of where a lot of this activity is happening. So that kind of gives us a little bit of sense of where we are with the more traditional nuclear electric. So there is a kind of a consensus that traditional nuclear electricity is simply not viable. It's not viable from a public reception standpoint. It's not viable from an economic standpoint. It's simply too expensive, can't compete. And from a potential safety standpoint, very much a big question mark. So then we start now to see the hype around small nuclear. And I hear this all the time when you get into these debates at energy conferences or places like that. The advocates for these kind of technologies, they're like, yeah, okay, you're talking old technology. These things are super safe. These things are super small. We can deploy these things quickly. They're inexpensive. Nuclear, small nuclear, going to be the, you can drive a trailer onto your parking lot and have a nuclear power plant. And you're like, yeah, okay, I'll believe it when I see it. But it's a bunch of hype around this. And it's been trying to be reframed as this is kind of the next generation of nuclear. It's not your father's nuclear power plant, so don't worry, young'un. This stuff is safe, small, and lean, mean generating machine. So who are the players in this marketplace? Well, one of the players, BWXT Technologies. This was one of the early entrants into this. And these folks they claim they're going to have a prototype ready by 2024. So bear in mind, when we talk about this industry per se, this industry that's been hyped, at least to me, for the last decade, it's been vaporware. It still is vaporware at the moment. All right. Then Bill Gates got into the act when he wasn't putting tracking chips in inoculations or whatever. And so anyway, we find that in 2008, Bill Gates invested in a company called TerraPower. They got about $80 million in federal funding to get this thing started up. And they're going to do something in Wyoming, but no deliverables just yet. Then we get to NewScale. And NewScale went public in 2022. And actually, they are the only company that has an approved design from the Nuclear Regulatory Agency. So they are considered the viable player, at least at the moment, in this particular industry. Then Westinghouse has what they're referring to as kind of a micro nuclear system. And I must sort of, I mean, I'm sure you can tell by my voice, I'm not keen on nuclear in any form or fashion, but this is the one thing that I was looking at when I was researching it that seemed somewhat maybe sort of viable, not from a health and safety standpoint, but from an economic and deployability standpoint. These are little 5 megawatt systems. So essentially a very big wind turbine. They call it Evinci. It's a plug and play kind of thing. They say that these things can be built in a factory and then built on site or deployed on site in about 30 days. So that gets past some of the thing about the long period of time and the ability to manufacture them and perhaps the size. So they could be little microgrid items. And then the last one is Kairos Power. And this is a molten salt reactor type, not a water reactor type. And they claim their prototype should be available 2030. So those are the 5 players. Those are the 5 big sort of big in quotes players in this small nuclear reactor world. Yeah, Pete just mentioned that, yeah, deployed in 30 days after you're in court for several years, which I think is not, I mean, it's a true comment. All of these things will be court challenged, no doubt. So it kind of leads you to say why is this activity happening when the viability, the technological viability, at least to my mind, seems pretty remote. And to me, it's look at, follow the money. So where are the dollars going from the federal government? One thing when I was looking at how much they're spending on this development of small nuclear, I did run across a lot of articles. Essentially, the Biden administration has decided to pump billions of dollars. I think it was about $8 billion to subsidize existing nuclear power plants, because all of these nuclear power plants are running at an economic loss. They simply cannot compete against the alternative energy forms, primarily wind and solar, but even natural gas, coal. Nuclear is far and away the most expensive form of electricity. The unfortunate side effect of this is that many of these nuclear power plants that might have been shut down are remaining open because they're being given a cash infusion from the federal government. But when we look at how much money has been pumped into research and development in the different energy technologies, if you look from really 1948 to 2018, almost half of all of the money the US government has invested in energy research has gone to nuclear. And it continues to be the dominant player, even right up to today. So when you talk about money that the US government is channeling into high-tech energy investments and research, it's nuclear. And clearly the nuclear industry has some pretty effective lobbyists that are working for them and pushing a lot of money into that particular industry. So I would suspect when you start looking at the balance sheets of those 5 main players in small nuclear, most of that revenue, most of the money that's keeping them afloat has come from the US government, from the taxpayers. So, if somebody's going to give you, $1 billion to look into something, well, maybe you'll take it. And maybe you'll deliver, maybe you won't. From the government standpoint, their argument would be, well, we need an all of the above energy solution as we move forward. This is one option that in the past has proven itself to work. Should we not then invest in the next generation and look and see, is this going to be a viable alternative? I'm going to argue no, but I'm wisely not in any position of power. So I also pulled up this diagram here talking about startups versus closures of nuclear power plants. And before I zoom in on that particular chart, I just was looking at since 2000. It's interesting to see that the nuclear industry worldwide, there have been 107 reactors that have begun their life in those years, and 109 that have closed. So, in looking past, you can basically see that by the year 2000, the nuclear industry was at best at a standstill. But if we look at the startups versus closures, the startups are in blue at the top, the closures in brown at the bottom. You can see that the heyday was right there in the 1985, 86, 87 time period, where we saw a growing number of reactors being deployed worldwide. And then, of course, right there in 1985, 86, in that time frame was Chernobyl. And at that point, you then see everything begin to change, where the new startups begin to decline dramatically, and then you start to see a lot of the existing systems being shut down. And then, of course, what doesn't show up in this graph is all of those that were planned that were never actually commissioned or completed. This diagram here in the U.S. Kind of points to that. There are currently 93 reactors, nuclear reactors, that are operating in the U.S. as of 2023. The number on the left, the 42, that's how many had been planned but had been abandoned or canceled during their construction phase. So 42 additional reactors had been underway, but then never happened. There is currently one reactor that is under construction. I think that's in Georgia. A lot of problems around that. I personally don't believe it's ever going to see the light of day, but people will argue with that, and maybe I'll be wrong. And then there's 41 that have been closed down here in recent years. Another meaningful number there is the one just below it, 41.9. That's the mean age, the median age of a reactor in the U.S. Now, bear in mind, most of these reactors were designed with a lifespan of 40 years in mind. And the average age of these reactors is more than that. So that begins to present, to me, kind of a worrying situation. If you've got a whole bunch of nuclear reactors that are operating past their sell-by date, then that, what could go wrong? So I think a lot of these were scheduled to be shut down, but because of this infusion of cash into the system, it may be that they're going to extend that life period. And I guess the last one there is that it's a significant amount of power that has been traditionally generated. This showed in 2021, it was 19.6. I think it's gone down than that, down less than that. So, it's still significant. And traditionally, nuclear has been one of the base loads because, again, nuclear is difficult to start up, difficult to shut down. So once the plant is operational and functioning, it tends to stay on and provide base load power. But then some of the other more agile forms of energy, like natural gas, become peaker plants. They meet higher end demands. They can be turned on and off like the burner on a stove, on a gas stove. So with the retirements, where some of these retirements plan, this was the best information I could find. They're not always very forthcoming with a lot of this information, but this kind of gives you a sense of where Some of these plants that are in the process of being perhaps shut down earlier. The darker the colors, the purple ones are really on the way out. The two there in Ohio and Pennsylvania, the Davis-Besse and the Perry plant, those were all caught up in the First Energy scandal, where First Energy was bribing the Ohio legislature. I think those are pretty much shut down, but they're still being subsidized by the ratepayers of the great state of Ohio. So a lot of these things are in the East Coast, and they're going to be shut down. So that's traditional. Okay, so now one of the other things that I hear about these small nuclear power plants is, you know what? Yeah, you may be against nuclear, but we've got a nuclear waste issue. And what are you going to do with all that nuclear waste? Well, we can develop these small nuclear power plants that can actually harvest nuclear waste to get their fuel, and can be essentially part of the cleanup process. Well, apparently that's not not really true. At least I couldn't find anybody who would say it's true. And in fact, Stanford just did a big study, and they found that actually these things are going to create a much bigger problem if they're ever deployed than solving. So they're going to create a whole new wave of nuclear waste, and nuclear disposal of that, or disposing of that waste, will become a bigger and bigger problem. Currently, my understanding is, because they shut down the Yucca Mountain disposal facility that was going to be in Nevada, most of the nuclear waste is simply stored in the parking lots of those power plants. So if you live near one of them, you've got an interesting issue there. And there is no real long-term plan on what to do with this, with all that waste. So I would argue that this is not solving a problem; it's simply creating another problem, in a different form and fashion. And now, that said, it's not going to work. It's a bad idea, and it's not going to work. The players are starting to drop. They're, even before they deploy it, even with vast amounts of government subsidies. This particular one, this was the power company. Let me see. I gotta read it because it blew my mind. The very first one. I've lost track in my brain already, but it's anyway, it's the only one that had been approved by the nuclear power, the nuclear regulatory facility. And they've announced they're not going to go through with their contract here to provide these small nuclear power plants. They have received $4 billion in government subsidies, but they're not able to do it. They raised their price of deliverable, how much it was going to be per kilowatt hour. They had started out at about 59 cents per kilowatt hour and raised it up to 5.9 cents, and they raised it up to about 8.9 cents. And then they just said, you know what, it's just not going to work. It's too expensive. So that's sort of the first death nail. This just happened. I think it's a harbinger of things to come, because they were the furthest along, the one that was considered to be viable. And now they've just kind of put the brakes on it and said, it's just not going to happen, at least not going to happen here in the United States. So that's an indication that we've got problems. In fact, it's just simply too expensive. I think I've got the numbers wrong here. It should be 8.9 cents, not 89 cents. But the rate there, compared to the alternatives, the generating cost is way too high. Nuclear is an industry that only works when it is massively subsidized, and it cannot compete with these alternatives. And one of the things that's frustrating to me is, I was listening to an economic analysis by somebody, I think from Goldman Sachs, and he was arguing why renewable energy isn't all that people like to say it is. And his argument was that we've seen this transition from coal, which was highly polluting, to natural gas, which was less polluting. But that in the renewable energy industry, it has simply been an industry that's been cannibalizing itself. And his argument there was the three renewable energy technologies, wind, solar, and nuclear, okay, well, nuclear and solar simply cannibalize the market share of nuclear. So that was his whole in-depth analysis. And I was thinking, man, this guy does not understand renewable energy at all. Yet he's the Goldman Sachs guy or whoever, whichever one it was of those big banks, talking. When you start linking renewable energy in with wind and solar, nuclear energy in with wind and solar, you can make a claim it's renewable, but that's like saying that airplanes are automotive because they move people around and they use fossil fuels. I mean, it's just a different industry altogether. It's just not something that I would want to put in with the more traditional renewable energies. So it's too expensive, too long to produce. This is another thing that becomes quite obvious when you start looking at these projections from these small companies. First off, getting the approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission takes 10 plus years. So that one company that just said they're not delivering, they were the only ones that had permission. And that was 10 years there. So then 8 years to construct a typical power plant. And as was pointed out here in our discussion, there are going to be lawsuits, there are going to be protests, there are going to be all sorts of delays. So now you're up to 18 years to get some of these things deployed. They're all still talking about, we're going to be giving you a prototype in a couple of years. So prototype, permission, construction, we're looking 20 years. Well, this is 2023. And we're looking at net zero goals by 2040. This technology, even if it works, is not going to be ready for prime time until the game is over. We better have already solved this problem before small nuclear even comes in as a player. So, plus it's still nuclear. It's still radioactive. It still has all of the problems of nuclear. So why would you be developing this over here when there are these other alternatives, wind, solar, battery storage? Even something like fusion has a better appeal. Hydrogen, I don't think either of those technologies are going to work, but if I were dumping money into it, I think what you're doing is paying off lobbyists. I mean, then the lobbyists must be pretty good. And then I will say that, as I said, this stuff is a good technology until something happens. Something is going to happen. There will be another nuclear disaster somewhere in the world. And when that happens, that's the death nail. I mean, I don't care how much people want to hype it up. The next Fukushima, the next Chernobyl, on any level is going to spell the end of this. You have an aging fleet of these power things. They're heavily subsidized to make it work. And the countries where they're operating are not necessarily known for strong safety and construction oversight. So you get a nuclear power plant, an aging nuclear power plant in a country like Bangladesh or something, and it has a meltdown. It's still a nuclear meltdown. It's still enough to cause this industry to come to a screeching halt. So bad idea. I think we can finally say the nuclear industry in the US for sure is dead. I would argue worldwide, it's dead as well. Undeniably and reliably dead. Now it's still kicking a little bit and it's still getting bailed out by certain governments, but it is a dead industry. All right. So that is my premise on that. Anybody have any comments or anything they want to add to that discussion point? Oh, all right. Well, hearing none, we'll call this meeting over and I'll see you guys next week. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.